On this occasion, the outlook in terms of weather was showing heavy rainstorms. The captain soon went on record to exclaim that he was feeling sleepy, and this is a very key point of interest. You see, Captain Park wasn't actually supposed to be commanding this flight. He was scheduled to captain a much longer flight to Dubai. However, his previous flight was delayed and therefore he didn't have the required rest time to be able to take that flight. So instead, he was rescheduled onto this shorter flight. Conversations recorded on the cockpit voice recording revealed that the captain may have felt he was being heavily worked. He made comments about the hours he was on duty and how Korean Air made pilots of the 747s work maximum hours. Evidently, he said it himself, he was feeling sleepy and was probably looking forward to getting some rest. I feel like it should go without saying because it is the case with almost any job, but flying a plane becomes a lot more difficult when one is fighting sleepiness. Tired in poor weather, rain, reduced visibility, and without a glide slope, this pilot was facing a lot of pressure. At 1:35, the final approach was commenced. The 747 connected with the localizer at the airport, and the plane was about to make its turn for final. And it's here where things started to go a bit off course. At this time, something rather peculiar occurred. The plane appeared to receive a glide slope signal. This certainly caught the attention of the pilots, especially Captain Park. The glide slope was supposed to be down, they weren't expecting it to come to life. What is believed to have happened was that the plane picked up some sort of rogue or erroneous signal that activated the system on their end. Confusion would only continue to grow as literally seconds later, the approach controller they were in communication with reminded them that the glide slope was unusable. The time was now 1:40. The plane was turning as it locked onto the ILS. As expected, at 2,500 feet, they intercepted the flake waypoint. Flight 801 was handed off from the approach controller to the tower, who then promptly cleared them for landing onto runway 06 left. The 747 was now descending through 2000. It was here, at precisely 1:41 in the morning, that things started to go wrong. Instead of following the procedure and leveling off at 2000 until reaching the outer marker, they continued to descend, drifting below their flight path. None of the pilots had noticed this, or at least they never spoke up about it at this point, which would later be cause for investigators to criticize Korean Air's pilot training. Pilots, if they have noticed a mistake or should something be wrong, should be encouraged to speak up and challenge the actions of other pilots where necessary. The tired captain fixated on the glide slope situation, and also in the middle of configuring the plane for landing and doing checklists, and without seeing much outside in the rain, the plane continued to drop lower and lower toward the range of hills below. The conversation about the glide slope would continue, and other flight crew members reminded the captain that it was non-functional. The first officer also noted to the captain that the runway was not in sight. They reached the outer marker point below their expected altitude. Now to note here that the audible alert this was supposed to give out was not heard on the cockpit voice recording. The words of the pilots gave no indication as to whether or not they acknowledged the flashing blue light in the cockpit, though the outer marker was tested after the accident and was deemed to be in working order. Even without this acknowledgement, it is noted in the approach chart that they should have leveled off again at this point, which was noted to have been 1.6 miles from the Nimitz VOR. It is believed by investigators that the pilots may have been mistaken in using this distance information, believing it was showing distance to the airport and expecting the runway to come into view when it reached 0, when in reality it was 3 miles further ahead. At around this time, the plane entered a patch of heavy rain, likely obscuring the view outside further. The pilots were now only seconds from disaster. The ground proximity warning system had sounded out that they were approaching the terrain below. Unable to see any sign of the airport, the first officer again says that the runway was not in sight. Still, the captain, under the effects of sleep fatigue, continued even as the plane was approaching the minimum's height. The ground proximity warning system makes the sink rate alert to tell the pilots they are descending too quickly. It then calls out 200, then rather quickly 100, an indication the plane was approaching steep terrain. The first officer suggested a go-around. At precisely 1:42 in 22 seconds, the captain called for a go-around. However, by this point, it was too late. Due to loss of situational awareness by the flight crew, including the captain facing fatigue, they had failed to execute the non-precision approach accordingly and failed to make the required steps. Because of this, they drifted into conflict with terrain when they should have leveled off at the required altitudes. Korean Air Flight 801 impacted the hillside just short of the Nimitz VOR. Over the course of the following seconds, the plane carved its way through the hills, breaking up into multiple sections. The crash occurred over a span of mere seconds. By the time the plane actually came to a rest, no one outside of the plane really knew what had happened. The tower controller was left confused as to why Flight 801 had not landed yet, even after they cleared them for landing. A recording of that very conversation between two controllers was actually released.
Approach, you got any Korean Air come back to you?
801?
Affirmative.
Korean Air 801, Guam. No.
You checked in with me, I cleared him to land. I don't know where he's at. Never did have him in sight.
You never saw him?
Negative.
He didn't land?
Negative.
My God.
I don't have him. He called me once. I cleared him to land, told him not in sight. I don't have him.
Well, he must have crashed then.
Once it was established that the plane was missing, search and rescue teams went out into the hills. The devastation the crash left in its wake made it hard for rescuers to reach the wreckage. The plane already crashed into a remote part of the island. Rescuers also had to contend with the weather. As the plane came over the hills, it destroyed an oil pipeline, blocking the only road access to the crash site. It took first responders about an hour to reach the plane. Within that time, a handful of passengers and a few flight attendants had managed to escape. It is unclear how many people died from the crash itself. However, reports from survivors suggest that some who did survive the initial crash still perished. As a post-crash fire raged across the accident site, a rather sad description of events suggested that the voices of those calling for help fell silent, and they did not make it out of the plane. Among those initial survivors was a 44-year-old Japanese woman by the name of Shigeko Matsuda. She was traveling to Guam with her 11-year-old daughter Rika, who was only a small girl and was largely uninjured in the crash. The mother, unable to free herself from the wreckage, encouraged her daughter to leave the plane without her. Shigeko died in the fire shortly after, and 11-year-old Rika, along with a flight attendant, were rescued by none other than the governor of Guam, who assisted in the rescue operation that night, Democrat politician Carl Gutierrez. In total, there were 229 deaths and 25 survivors. The loss of Korean Air Flight 801 was one of the deadliest air disasters involving South Korea. It came during a time when Korean Air was seen as an air carrier with a poor safety record. Investigators put the accident down to pilot error, citing the pilot's fatigue, failure to appropriately brief his crew for the localizer-only approach, further poor communication between the crew, and insufficient training at Korean Air. However, investigators did not stop at the operation of the plane. Criticism was leveled at the Federal Aviation Administration, who made an exemption for the Guam airport to switch off a key piece of equipment that could have prevented the crash. A system called the Minimum Safe Altitude Warning, or MSAW, alerts air traffic control if an aircraft is about to enter a controlled flight into terrain scenario, exactly like what happened in this case. The MSAW was disabled, switched off, because in the case of Guam, it was known for causing nuisance alerts. To interject with my own opinion, I find this to be a rather frustrating aspect of this disaster. Part of the reason why flying is as safe as it is today is because we have technology like this. When we know it's there to prevent accidents and save lives, turning it off is just unacceptable. It was determined that if the MSAW system had been on, there would have been sufficient time for the plane to be notified, and the accident may not have occurred.